The early morning glimmer. The dawn's first light crept over Silverwind Airport, casting a gentle glow across the empty hallways. Morris Watson, a 29-year-old security officer, adjusted his blue uniform, the fabric crisp and pressed, signaling the start of yet another shift. 5 years had passed since Morris took this job, each day blending into the next with the predictable rhythm of travelers. Airports, he'd learned, were places of transition, people moving through them in a rush of emotion, barely pausing before disappearing into the sky or the city streets. Silverwind was no different, a place of fleeting connections and rushed goodbyes. As he walked through the arrivals hall, surveying the passengers who had already started to trickle in, he noticed the usual: tired parents clutching yawning toddlers, business travelers glued to their phones, and the occasional vacationer carrying souvenirs from faraway places. Each person held a story, though Morris had long since stopped trying to decipher them. His duty was to keep people safe, not to dig into their lives. But something felt different that morning. There was an unusual calmness in the air, a quiet anticipation. Morris's gaze drifted to a figure sitting alone on a bench, an elderly man, impeccably dressed in a well-kept beige suit. He looked out of place, too formal for the setting, as if he'd stepped out of another time. Beside him was a small, worn travel pillow, and on his lap rested a bouquet of red roses, slightly wilted as though they'd been held onto for too long. The man sat with a certain dignity, his back straight, and his gaze fixed on the flow of passengers before him. There was a steadiness to his demeanor, an aura of quiet patience, and yet something about the way he clutched the roses, the way his eyes scanned every face passing by, seemed to convey a deep longing. Morris found himself lingering, watching the man from a distance, feeling a curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time. He approached slowly, as if not to disturb the silent bubble surrounding the elderly gentleman. As he neared, the man looked up, his eyes a bright, piercing blue, softened with age yet still clear as day. "Good morning, sir," Morris greeted him with a gentle nod. "Are you waiting for someone?" The old man's face brightened with a soft smile, and he nodded. "Yes, young man, waiting for someone very special." His voice was calm, almost reverent, and it carried a softness that seemed to fill the quiet space around him. Morris glanced at the roses, a silent testament to his devotion. "You must have been waiting for a while. These flowers look like they've been through a lot," he noted, unable to hide the gentle concern in his voice. The man chuckled softly, his fingers tracing the delicate petals. "They were fresh when I got them," he replied, his tone as wistful as it was proud. "I've been here. Well, it's been a few days. But she's worth it. She'll be here soon, I'm sure." Morris's brows knit together slightly. "A few days?" he asked, the concern in his voice now unmistakable. "That's quite a long time to wait. Are you sure her flight hasn't been delayed? We've got information boards over there that—" "Oh, I've checked," the man interrupted, still smiling. "But no, she hasn't come yet. It's just a matter of time. Patience is the key, you know." His voice was filled with a quiet wisdom, the kind Morris imagined only came with age. Feeling oddly moved, Morris took a seat on the bench next to him. "May I ask who it is you're waiting for?" The man's eyes took on a distant, dreamy quality. "My Eleanor," he said simply. "We've been separated for quite some time now, but she promised me she'd come back. This airport, you know, is where we met, all those years ago." He paused, a tender smile playing on his lips. "She was coming back from a business trip, all stressed out and busy, and I was waiting to surprise her. She'd always loved roses." A flood of memories seemed to light up the man's face as he spoke, the lines around his mouth deepening with his smile. She was fierce and determined, too busy for anyone, or so she thought. But when I handed her that bouquet of roses, well, let's just say it stopped her in her tracks. I think we both knew in that moment that our lives were going to change. Morris felt a warmth bloom in his chest as he listened, feeling as if he were being drawn into a world far removed from the bustling airport around him. "That's a beautiful story, sir," he said softly. "It sounds like the two of you shared something very special." The man nodded, his smile fading as his eyes drifted back to the crowd. "She promised me," he whispered, almost to himself. "She said she'd be here when I needed her most. I don't know where she's coming from, exactly, but I know she'll come." Morris felt a strange chill run through him, as though he were witnessing something both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Would you like some help, sir? Perhaps I could speak to someone at the information desk, check if there are any delays or issues." The man shook his head, his expression resolute. "No need, young man. She'll be here. I just have to wait a little longer." He squeezed Morris's hand gently. "But thank you for your kindness. It's rare these days." Morris nodded, feeling a connection to the old man that he couldn't quite explain. "I'll check in on you later, sir, just to make sure you're doing all right." The man chuckled, tipping an imaginary hat. "I'll be here, young man. Don't you worry about me." As Morris rose to continue his rounds, he glanced back at the man, who had resumed his silent vigil, his gaze focused intently on the crowd. There was something unyielding in his posture, a quiet determination that seemed to keep him rooted in that very spot. Morris shook his head, brushing off the strange sense of foreboding that lingered in the air. Surely, he thought, the man's story had a logical explanation. Perhaps he was simply a man caught in a memory, waiting for a reunion that had already taken place in the past. But as he walked away, Morris couldn't help but feel that this man's wait was more than just a memory. The man's story of love had touched something in Morris's heart, a reminder of his own grandmother who used to wait by the window every Sunday for his grandfather, even long after he'd passed. There was something timeless and profound about waiting, he realized, something that bound people to moments they couldn't bear to lose. For the rest of the day, Morris found himself glancing back toward the arrivals hall, scanning the crowd for any sign of the elderly man's Eleanor. But as the hours slipped by, there was no sign of her, nor any hint that the man's wait would soon be over. When Morris's shift ended, he returned to the arrivals hall one last time, feeling the pull of a connection he couldn't quite name. The old man was still there, his gaze fixed, his posture still, his roses growing more wilted by the hour. "Good night, sir," Morris called out softly as he passed. The old man gave a small nod, his eyes never leaving the crowd. "Good night, young man," he replied, his voice a quiet murmur in the growing silence of the terminal. And as Morris stepped out into the evening, the image of the elderly man, alone, waiting with his bouquet of roses, was etched in his mind, a mystery he couldn't shake. Whispers in the terminal. Morris couldn't shake the image of the elderly man with the roses from his mind. As he walked back through the terminal the following morning, he found himself scanning the benches, half expecting the man to be gone, reunited with his special someone. But as he rounded the corner into the arrivals hall, there he was, sitting in the same place, his back slightly more hunched, the roses drooping further, their once vibrant red turning a deeper, sadder hue. Morris approached cautiously, reluctant to disturb the man's vigil, but equally compelled to offer a helping hand. He noticed something he hadn't seen the day before. The man's hands were trembling slightly, fingers curled protectively around the stems of the flowers, as if they were his lifeline. "Good morning, sir," Morris greeted him warmly, his voice low, respectful of the quiet tension hanging in the air. The elderly man looked up, and recognition sparked in his eyes. His face softened, lines deepening as a faint smile appeared. "Ah, young man, you're back," he said, his voice weak but gentle. "I'm still here, as you can see." Morris nodded, returning the smile. "I see that, sir. Any sign of her arrival?" He hesitated, remembering the name the man had whispered the previous day, Eleanor. A shadow crossed the man's face, and his eyes drifted back to the entrance. "No, not yet." He sounded almost apologetic, as if embarrassed that he hadn't yet found who he was waiting for. "But I'm certain it won't be much longer. She'll come," he added, his voice layered with a strange mix of hope and resignation. Morris paused, glancing at the flowers, the slightly crumpled travel pillow at the man's side, and the weariness etched into his expression. Something tugged at him, urging him to help this man, this stranger who seemed more familiar to him than many others he encountered daily. There was an air about him, a kind of stubborn dignity that made Morris want to protect him, even if he didn't fully understand why. "Sir," Morris began gently, "is there someone I could call for you? A family member or a friend? Just to let them know you're here, waiting. Or maybe I could help check the flight information, see if there's been any change or delay." The man shook his head slowly, but there was a hint of a grateful smile in his eyes. "No, son, thank you. I appreciate your kindness, but there's no one left to call. I'm afraid it's just me now." His words hung in the air, weighted with a sadness that pierced through Morris's heart. There was something final about the way he said it, a quiet acceptance that spoke of someone who had long since come to terms with loneliness. Morris didn't know what to say, so he sat beside the man, allowing a moment of silence to stretch between them, as if they were both trying to bridge an invisible gap. Finally, the man broke the silence. "You remind me of him," he murmured, almost to himself. Morris glanced at him, curious. "Of who, sir?" The man's gaze drifted to some far-off place, his eyes misty and unfocused. "Of my son, James. He was about your age when he passed, almost 10 years ago now. He had a kind heart, like yours. Always looked out for others, even strangers." The words hit Morris like a sudden wave. He felt an unexpected warmth in his chest, mixed with a pang of sorrow. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you." The old man nodded, his gaze still distant. "James was a good boy," he said quietly. "He and his mother were my world. Losing him, that was something I never quite recovered from." He paused, and for a moment, his eyes drifted to the roses, his fingers brushing their soft, fading petals. Morris didn't know how to respond, so he simply sat there, listening as the man spoke, letting him unburden himself of a grief that had likely lingered unspoken for years. "She'll come, you know," the man said after a moment, as if trying to convince himself as much as Morris. "Eleanor, she promised me. Even if it takes a lifetime, she promised she'd be here." The conviction in his voice made Morris pause. This man wasn't just waiting for someone. He was waiting for a reunion that had kept him alive, that had given him purpose. Morris could see it now. This wasn't just about love. It was about loyalty, faith, and a promise that had transcended time and loss. As the hours passed, Morris found himself returning to the man's side periodically, checking in, offering him water, a sandwich, anything to make him comfortable. And each time, the man would thank him with a smile, his eyes never straying from the entrance, his hope unwavering. Word of the elderly man had begun to spread among the airport staff, and soon enough, others were stopping by, curious to see the man with the roses. Some whispered, others merely looked on, captivated by his quiet strength and his dedication. There were even a few travelers who, upon noticing him, would leave a small snack or bottle of water, a silent gesture of respect for a man whose story had touched them, even if they didn't know it. It was nearing evening when Morris approached him once more, noticing a weariness in the man's posture, a subtle drooping of his shoulders. He seemed smaller somehow, more fragile. "Sir, are you sure there's no one I can call? No one you'd like to know you're here?" Morris asked, unable to hide the concern in his voice. The man shook his head gently. "No, son. But thank you." He looked down at the roses, a faint sadness creeping into his eyes. "If anything, I'd like to ask a favor, if it's not too much trouble." Morris leaned in, ready to help in any way he could. "Of course, sir. Anything. If for some reason she doesn't make it." He paused, his voice faltering for the first time. "Could you Take these roses to gate 14 tomorrow morning." That was our gate, you see. It was where we always met. She'd know they were from me. Morris felt his throat tighten. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. I promise." The old man's face softened, relief washing over him. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I know she'll come, but just in case." They sat there in silence as the evening wore on, the terminal emptying until only a few stragglers remained, their footsteps echoing faintly in the vast space. Morris felt an overwhelming urge to stay with the man, to keep him company as he waited, as if his presence might somehow ease the weight of the man's vigil. But when the time came to end his shift, Morris stood, giving the man a reassuring smile. "I'll be back tomorrow morning," he promised, "just like today." The old man looked up at him, a mixture of hope and gratitude in his gaze. "Thank you, young man. It means more than you know." As Morris walked away, he turned back one last time, watching as the man resumed his vigil, his eyes fixed on the entrance with an unwavering hope. The roses lay on his lap, their color deepening in the dim airport lights, a silent testament to a love that had endured beyond time. The drive home was filled with a quiet melancholy that lingered long after Morris had left the airport behind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something profound, something that defied the logic and reason that ruled his daily life. This man's weight, his loyalty to a promise, spoke of a kind of love that Morris hadn't seen in a long time. It was beautiful, yes, but there was a tragedy to it as well, a sadness that left him unsettled. That night, Morris lay awake in bed, haunted by the image of the man waiting alone in the airport, clutching his fading roses. He wondered what it meant to love someone so deeply that you would wait for them, even when hope seemed all but lost. It was a love he couldn't fully understand but felt privileged to have witnessed, even from a distance. And though he didn't know why, Morris resolved to return the next day, to make sure that the man wasn't waiting alone, that his faith and love wasn't met with silence. Because in some way he couldn't explain, Morris knew that this man's story wasn't over. Not yet. The weight of waiting. Morris couldn't keep his mind off the elderly man as he drove to work the next morning. He had barely slept, haunted by the image of the man waiting patiently on that cold bench, clutching the wilting roses as though they were the only thing tethering him to the earth. The man's story had stirred something within Morris, an ache he couldn't fully understand, a blend of empathy and concern that felt deeply personal, though he barely knew the man. When he finally arrived at Silverwind Airport, Morris headed straight for the arrivals hall, bypassing his usual routine. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the large glass windows, casting a warm glow over the terminal, but it did little to soothe the gnawing feeling in his chest. He rounded the corner, half expecting to find the bench empty, the old man gone. But there he was, in the same spot, looking just as Morris had left him. Only this time, the man's posture was different. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed, and his gaze had lost some of its previous spark. The roses, too, had faded further, their once vibrant red now a muted maroon, petals wilting in the morning light. Morris took a deep breath, steadying himself before walking over. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the sight of the man's weariness tugged at him in a way that made his chest feel heavy. "Good morning, sir," Morris greeted softly, taking a seat beside him. The elderly man looked up, his eyes brightening momentarily as he recognized Morris. "Ah, you're back," he murmured, a faint smile appearing. "I didn't think you'd return so early." Morris returned the smile, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I wanted to check on you. It's not often I meet someone so dedicated. Are you all right? Have you had any news?" He tried to keep his tone light, though his concern was evident. The man sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "No news, I'm afraid. But I don't mind the waiting," he said softly. "It's something I've grown accustomed to." He paused, glancing down at the roses, as if they held some secret only he could decipher. Love teaches you patience, doesn't it?" he added, more to himself than to Morris. Morris nodded, unsure of how to respond. This man's patience, his quiet devotion, was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. It felt sacred, in a way, like something out of a storybook. But seeing him there, day after day, alone and waiting, it was almost too much to bear. "You know," Morris began, choosing his words carefully, "there are some things we don't have to face alone. You've got people here who care. The staff, myself, we're all worried about you." The old man's face softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on Morris's arm. "That means a great deal, young man. It really does. But some journeys are meant to be made alone." Morris felt a pang in his chest. He wanted to argue, to convince the man that he didn't have to bear this burden by himself. But he could see in the man's eyes a quiet acceptance, a resignation that spoke of someone who had long since made peace with his path. They sat in silence for a while, watching as the morning crowd began to fill the terminal. The usual mix of travelers passed by, businessmen in tailored suits, families with overstuffed luggage, college students clutching coffee cups as they juggled their phones. But Morris couldn't focus on any of them. His mind was fixed on the man beside him, on the mystery that lingered in the air between them. After a few minutes, the man spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost her, you know. My Eleanor. It's been years now." Morris felt his breath catch, a mixture of surprise and sadness washing over him. He had suspected, of course, that there was more to the story, but hearing it confirmed left him with a deep sense of loss he couldn't quite explain. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine." The old man shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "It's all right, son. She was a wonderful woman. Strong, kind, fiercely intelligent. She had a way of making everyone around her feel special, like they were the only person in the room." His gaze grew distant, his eyes softening as memory surfaced. "We met here, you know, right in this very terminal. She was late for her flight, of course, always running late, my Eleanor. I was just a young man back then, nervous as anything, clutching a bouquet of roses much like these." Morris listened, captivated, as the man's voice took on a warmth, a nostalgia that filled the empty spaces of the terminal. He could almost picture it, the young version of this man, standing in the bustling airport, waiting with a nervous excitement for the woman he loved. "I waited for her then, just as I'm waiting now," the man continued, a faint smile touching his lips. "I guess some things never change." Morris's heart ached at the thought of it. The idea of this man returning to the same place year after year, waiting, hoping for a reunion that might never come. It was both beautiful and tragic, a testament to a love that had transcended time and loss. "Why? Why do you come back here?" Morris asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man looked at him, his eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering resolve. "Because I promised her I would. She was taken from me too soon, and I couldn't be with her in her final moments. So I made a vow to come here, to wait for her. Just in case," he trailed off, his voice breaking slightly, "just in case she found a way back." Morris swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He didn't know what to say, how to offer comfort to a man whose grief was so deeply ingrained, so intimately tied to this place, this act of waiting. They sat in silence again, the noise of the terminal fading into the background, as Morris tried to process the weight of the man's story. He felt a sense of helplessness, a desperation to do something, anything, to ease the man's pain. But what could he offer? Words felt inadequate, and gestures seemed hollow in the face of such profound loss. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "You know, sir, you may be alone in your wait, but you're not without company. We're all here for you, the staff, the travelers who pass by. We're all witnesses to your love. And I think that matters, even if she can't be here, even if." He hesitated, feeling his words falter. "I think your love deserves to be seen." The man looked at him, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, son," he said quietly. "You have no idea how much that means to me." As the day wore on, Morris found himself returning to the man's side whenever he could, offering him coffee, a sandwich, or just a few moments of quiet companionship. And with each passing hour, he watched as other airport staff, and even some travelers, began to take notice, leaving small gifts, snacks, bottles of water, even a fresh bouquet of roses. It was as though the entire terminal had come together in silent solidarity, honoring the man's wait, bearing witness to a love that had endured beyond life itself. By evening, the bench beside the man was filled with small tokens, symbols of empathy and respect from strangers who had felt the depth of his story without ever hearing a word. Morris watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride and sadness as he saw the man look at each gift, his eyes filled with tears. As Morris's shift came to an end, he walked over to the man one last time, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I'll see you tomorrow, sir," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The man looked up, his face weary but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, son," he whispered. "Thank you for seeing me. For seeing us." And as Morris walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been part of something profound, something that went beyond words or explanations. He had witnessed a love that had withstood the passage of time, a devotion that had remained unbroken even in the face of loss. That night, as he lay in bed, Morris thought of the man, of the roses, of the quiet, unyielding patience that had filled the terminal that day. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he would return the next morning, not just for duty, but for a purpose that had transcended his understanding. Because some things, some stories, some loves, were worth waiting for, even if the wait seemed endless. The promise of tomorrow. Morris couldn't remember a time he'd felt this restless. His entire night had been spent tossing and turning, haunted by the image of the elderly man with the fading roses, the glint of hope in his tired eyes. He found himself counting down the hours until his next shift, anxious to return to the airport and see if the man had finally found the reunion he'd been waiting for. As he arrived at Silverwind Airport in the dim early light, Morris moved quickly through security, his heart beating faster as he approached the arrivals hall. Part of him expected the bench to be empty, for the man to have found peace and gone home at last. But as he rounded the corner, there he was, seated in the same place, his head bent low, the bouquet of roses resting on his lap like a delicate weight. The sight made Morris's chest tighten. The roses had faded further, their edges brown and curling, their once vibrant color now a shadow of its former self. The man looked even frailer today, his back more hunched, his posture lacking the quiet dignity it had held before. He was slipping, Morris realized, slipping into a weariness too deep for a simple rest to cure. But as Morris approached, the man lifted his head, and when he saw Morris, a faint smile appeared, softening the deep lines in his face. "You're back again, young man," he said, his voice a little weaker but carrying the same warmth it had before. Morris took a seat beside him, nodding. "Yes, sir. I couldn't stay away. I wanted to make sure you were doing all right." The old man chuckled softly, a sound that was both comforting and bittersweet. "Well, I'm still here, aren't I? Can't seem to shake this stubborn habit of mine." He looked down at the roses, his fingers tracing the delicate, wilting petals with a tenderness that struck Morris to the core. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching as the morning light filled the terminal, casting a golden glow across the bustling travelers. There was something surreal about the contrast between the vibrant life around them and the quiet, almost sacred atmosphere surrounding the man. It was as if he were in a world of his own, untouched by the passage of time, existing solely in the space between memory and reality. "Have you ever waited for someone, son?" the man asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on a spot far off in the distance. Morris thought for a moment, his mind flickering through memories of people and places, but nothing compared to the kind of waiting this man was experiencing. He shook his head. "Not like this, sir. Not for this long." The man nodded, as if he'd expected the answer. "Most people wouldn't understand," he murmured. "They think waiting is a waste of time, a sign of weakness. But they don't know. They don't know what it's like to love someone so deeply that time becomes irrelevant. That waiting becomes, well, it becomes a part of you." Morris's throat tightened, and he found himself struggling to hold back his emotions. This man's words held a wisdom he couldn't fully grasp, a depth that resonated in a place he hadn't known existed. Morris felt a pang of regret, a sadness for all the moments he might have taken for granted, the people he might have overlooked. "Do you ever wonder," the man continued, his voice soft, "what it would be like to wait forever? To be certain that, no matter how long it takes, they'll come back to you." Morris swallowed hard, unable to look away from the man's weary gaze. I don't know," he admitted. I suppose it would be hard. But if you love someone that much, I think it might be worth it." The old man nodded, a look of quiet satisfaction crossing his face. "Yes, that's exactly it. It's worth it. Every second, every minute. Because when you love someone with all your heart, waiting isn't a burden. It's a choice, a promise." His words lingered in the air, filling the silence between them with a weight Morris could feel pressing down on his chest. He wondered what it would be like to carry such a promise, to hold on to a love so profound that it could withstand the test of time and loss. Just then, one of the flight attendants, a young woman with a gentle smile, approached them, holding out a fresh cup of coffee. "Here you go, sir," she said kindly, offering the cup to the elderly man. "We all chipped in to make sure you have something warm. It's a little chilly in here this morning." The man looked up, surprise flashing across his face, followed by a deep gratitude that softened his features. "Why, thank you, my dear," he murmured, accepting the coffee with both hands. "You're all too kind. I don't deserve this." The flight attendant smiled, glancing briefly at Morris before turning back to the man. "Oh, but you do, sir. You've reminded us all of something very important. Something beautiful." With that, she walked away, leaving them in a quiet filled with unspoken understanding. Morris felt a warmth in his chest, a swelling pride for the kindness his colleagues had shown. In a world that often moved too fast, it was a rare and beautiful thing to see people pause, to show compassion, to acknowledge someone else's pain. As the morning wore on, Morris noticed more people stopping by, leaving small tokens, a muffin, a bottle of water, a blanket to ward off the morning chill. Some simply smiled at the man, nodding respectfully before moving on, while others whispered words of encouragement, quiet reassurances that he wasn't alone in his wait. Morris watched as the man's eyes filled with tears, his expression a mixture of surprise and deep gratitude. "I never expected," he whispered, his voice trembling. I thought no one noticed." Morris placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "People see more than you think, sir. And they care. We all care." The man nodded, his gaze drifting to the collection of gifts now surrounding him. "It's strange, you know," he murmured. "All my life, I thought waiting was something I had to do alone. I never imagined that strangers could share in my wait, that they could understand." Morris's chest tightened, and he found himself fighting back tears. This man's wait, his quiet devotion, had touched everyone in the terminal, strangers who had felt the weight of his love without even knowing the full story. As the day stretched into afternoon, Morris stayed by the man's side, listening as he shared stories of his life with Eleanor, the adventures they'd taken, the laughter they'd shared, the moments of quiet contentment that had defined their love. Each story painted a picture of a woman who had been as vibrant as the roses he clutched, a woman whose spirit seemed to linger in every corner of the airport, as if she were there with them in some invisible way. By evening, the terminal had begun to empty, the day's travelers dwindling to a trickle. The soft hum of voices faded, leaving a peaceful silence that seemed to wrap around them like a warm blanket. Morris glanced at the elderly man, who sat quietly, his gaze focused on the fading roses in his lap. "Sir," Morris said softly, breaking the silence, "I know you've been waiting for a long time, and I don't want to intrude, but if there's anything I can do, if there's any way I can help you find peace, please let me know." The man looked at him, his eyes filled with a sadness that was almost tangible. "You've already helped more than you know, son," he murmured. "You've listened, you've seen me, and that's more than I could have ever asked for." Morris felt a lump rise in his throat, and he swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "I just want you to know," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "that you're not alone. We're all here with you, and whatever happens, we'll be here tomorrow, and the next day, and as long as it takes." The old man's face softened, and he reached out, placing a trembling hand on Morris's arm. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." They sat in silence as the night settled over the terminal, the only sound the soft hum of distant announcements, and the gentle rustle of the roses as the man's fingers traced their delicate petals. And as Morris looked at him, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his heart, a certainty that, no matter what, he would be here for this man, that he would bear witness to his wait, that he would honor the love that had kept him going all these years. Because some promises, some waits, were too sacred to face alone. A call for backup. The weight of the elderly man's story lingered with Morris like a heavy mist, blurring the lines between duty and compassion. Each time he returned to the arrivals hall, he felt the pull of the man's presence, an unspoken call that compelled him to sit by the old man's side, even if it was only for a few quiet moments. The man's weight had transformed the terminal. What was once a busy, impersonal space had become a place filled with compassion, as if the terminal itself were bending to accommodate the sacredness of his vigil. That morning, Morris noticed something different in the man's demeanor. His shoulders were more slumped than usual, his breathing labored, and the slight tremble in his hands had worsened. The roses, too, were nearly gone, their edges shriveled, petals falling one by one to the floor. The man's grip on them remained firm, as if letting go would somehow dissolve his connection to Eleanor entirely. Morris watched him from a distance, a sense of urgency gnawing at him. Each day, the man seemed to fade a little more, his resilience slipping like sand through fingers. As Morris approached, the man turned his head slowly, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Ah, young man, you're here again," he murmured, his voice faint but warm. Morris smiled, trying to hide the concern etched on his face. "Of course, sir. I told you. We're all here for you." He glanced at the empty seat beside him, then at the faded roses. Have you seen her today? Any sign?" The man looked away, his gaze distant. "No," he whispered. "Not yet. But I still feel her, you know. Like she's close, just beyond the door. I can't explain it." He paused, his brow creasing. "It's almost as if she's waiting too." Morris took a deep breath, steadying himself. He could see the toll the weight was taking on the man. His body was visibly weaker, his voice trembling more with each word. Morris felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him. He couldn't bear to see this man suffer alone any longer. "Sir," he said gently, "I think it might be a good idea to take a break. You've been here for so long, and you look tired. How about I help you to the lounge, just for a little while? I can get you something to eat, maybe a cup of tea." The man shook his head slowly, his expression resolute. "Thank you, son, but I can't leave. Not now. If I leave, she might come, and I'd miss her." His fingers curled tightly around the roses, as if he were afraid they might vanish from his grasp. "No, I must stay. I promised her." Morris's chest tightened as he saw the determination in the man's eyes, a resolve that bordered on desperation. He knew there was no convincing him to leave, not as long as he held on to the hope of seeing Eleanor again. "Okay," Morris said softly, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. Then I'll stay too. For as long as you need." They sat together in silence, the quiet hum of the terminal fading into the background. Morris could feel the sadness radiating from the man, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have its own presence, like a shadow that clung to him, refusing to let go. He felt a helplessness gnawing at him, a frustration that he couldn't do more to ease the man's pain. As the hours passed, Morris noticed the man's breathing becoming more labored, his face growing pale. Alarm prickled at the edges of his consciousness, and he felt a rising sense of urgency. The man's condition was deteriorating before his eyes, and Morris knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. "Sir," he said gently, leaning in closer, "I'm going to get some help, just to make sure you're all right." The man looked at him, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "No, please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't need a doctor. I just need her." Morris hesitated, torn between honoring the man's wishes and doing what he knew was necessary. But as he looked into the man's eyes, he saw a vulnerability, a plea that broke through his resolve. The man's body was frail, his spirit worn thin from the endless waiting. Morris knew he couldn't let him suffer alone any longer. "Just give me one moment," Morris murmured, squeezing the man's shoulder before rising to his feet. He walked quickly toward the security desk, his heart pounding as he explained the situation to a colleague. Within minutes, he had called for paramedics, hoping they would arrive in time to help the elderly man. When he returned to the bench, the man was leaning back, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Morris felt a pang of fear, his hands trembling as he reached out, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. The man opened his eyes slowly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm fine, son," he whispered. "Just tired. So very tired." Morris's throat tightened, and he felt a surge of emotion rise within him. He didn't know this man, not really, but in these past few days, he had come to feel a bond, a connection that went beyond words. He wanted to protect him, to ease his suffering, to somehow bring him the peace he so desperately needed. As they waited for the paramedics, the man's gaze drifted to the entrance, his eyes softening with a longing that cut through Morris's heart. "You know," he murmured, "Eleanor and I used to sit here, right in this very spot. We would watch the planes together, talk about all the places we wanted to visit. She always said she wanted to see the world, to taste the rain in every country, to feel the sun from every shore." Morris listened, his chest tight with emotion, as the man's voice grew weaker. It was as if he were reliving those moments, each memory bringing a flicker of life to his tired eyes. She was my whole world," the man continued, his voice barely a whisper. "When she passed, I felt like a part of me went with her. But I promised her I'd be here, that I'd wait. And I have. All these years, I've kept my promise." Morris swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists as he fought to hold back tears. The man's love, his devotion, it was a force he couldn't fully comprehend, a depth of feeling that transcended anything he had ever known. And as he looked at the man, he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of purpose, a determination to honor this love, to make sure it was seen, recognized, remembered. When the paramedics arrived, Morris stood back, watching as they gently helped the man onto a stretcher. He could see the confusion in the man's eyes, the fear that leaving would mean breaking his promise, abandoning the vigil he had kept for so long. "It's all right, sir," Morris said softly, stepping forward. "I'll be here. I'll wait for you. And if she comes, I'll tell her where to find you. I promise." The man looked at him, his eyes filling with gratitude and relief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for everything." As the paramedics wheeled him away, Morris felt a hollow ache in his chest, a sadness that seemed to settle deep within him. He watched until they disappeared from view, the man's faint silhouette etched into his memory like a ghost that would haunt him forever. When he returned to the bench, Morris found himself staring at the empty space, the faint scent of roses lingering in the air. He sat down, feeling the weight of the man's presence, the echo of his love filling the silence. And in that quiet moment, Morris made a promise to himself, a promise to honor this man's wait, to keep his story alive. Because some loves, he realized, were too powerful to fade, too sacred to be forgotten. They deserved to be witnessed, remembered, cherished. As the hours passed, Morris found himself glancing at the entrance, his heart heavy with hope, a part of him waiting, just as the man had. Waiting for a reunion that might never come, but one that he knew, deep down, was worth every second. The legacy of a promise. The silence felt heavier after the old man was taken away, a haunting absence in the space where he'd once sat so faithfully. Morris remained on the bench, staring at the roses the man had left behind. Each petal, now curled and brittle, held a trace of his story, a memory of his devotion to the love that had kept him tethered here. Morris felt that if he could just sit still enough, quiet enough, he might still feel the old man's presence, a whisper of his spirit lingering in the air. As Morris sat, lost in thought, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Lisa, a fellow security officer who had watched the elderly man wait alongside Morris over the past week. Her eyes were soft, filled with an understanding that needed no words. "I heard they took him to the hospital," she said quietly. "Do you know if he'll be all right?" Morris shook his head, unable to hide the sadness that darkened his face. "I don't know. He was so weak, Lisa. I'm afraid he might not come back." Lisa sighed, sitting down beside him. "You know, I think we all felt like we were a part of his story. He had that effect on people. Watching him wait like that, it reminded me of my grandmother waiting for my grandfather to come home from the war. It's rare to see that kind of love anymore." Morris nodded, a lump rising in his throat as he recalled the man's quiet words, his unwavering belief that Eleanor would come back. He kept saying she promised to return. He believed it, Lisa. Every day, he sat here, clutching those roses like they were the only thing keeping him alive. They fell into silence, watching as travelers moved through the terminal, oblivious to the heartbreak that had unfolded just hours before. The bench felt hollow, empty without the man's presence, as if it were missing a piece of itself. "What are you going to do?" Lisa asked after a while, glancing at Morris with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Morris looked down at the roses, their fragile beauty fading, yet still a symbol of the love they represented. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the man's story end here, not without a final act to honor the promise he had kept so diligently. "I'm going to take these roses to gate 14, Morris said, his voice steady with determination. "He told me that was their gate, the place where they always met. If she was coming back, he said she'd know to find him there." Lisa's eyes softened, a faint smile touching her lips. "That's a beautiful thing to do, Morris. I think it's what he would have wanted." With a nod, Morris rose to his feet, carefully gathering the roses. The petals crumbled slightly in his hands, their faded red casting a soft, muted glow against his palms. He cradled them as if they were delicate artifacts, relics of a love that had endured beyond time. The walk to gate 14 was surreal. He felt as though he were retracing steps the man and Eleanor had once taken, each footfall resonating with memories he could only imagine. The terminal's usual noise faded into a low hum, as if the entire space were honoring the solemnity of his journey. Travelers moved around him in a blur, their faces indistinct as Morris focused solely on his destination. When he reached gate 14, he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This was the place where the man had waited, year after year, believing in the possibility of a reunion. Morris could almost see him, a younger version of himself, standing here with fresh roses, his heart full of nervous anticipation as he waited for Eleanor to come through the gate. He placed the roses on the empty seat beside him, smoothing the crumpled petals with gentle fingers. In that moment, he felt as if he were completing the man's journey, honoring the promise that had kept him alive for so long. And then he waited. Hours passed, and as each minute ticked by, Morris felt the weight of the old man's weight settling onto his own shoulders. He thought of the man's stories, his soft voice filled with memories of a love that had defied the constraints of time and space. He remembered the way the man's eyes had softened whenever he spoke of Eleanor, the reverence in his voice as he recalled their years together. As he sat there, travelers came and went, some glancing curiously at the roses on the seat, others too absorbed in their own lives to notice. Morris lost track of time, the minutes blending together in a quiet reflection. He wondered if, somehow, the man could sense what he was doing, if he could feel the silent tribute Morris was paying to the love that had bound him to this place. Just as the evening sun cast its last golden rays through the airport windows, a voice sounded behind him. "Excuse me, are those roses for someone?" Morris turned, startled. Standing before him was an elderly woman, her hair silver and neatly pinned back, her eyes a striking shade of blue that seemed to hold a lifetime of memories. She wore a gentle smile, though there was a hint of sorrow in her gaze, as if she, too, had known the weight of waiting. "They are," Morris replied softly, his heart racing. "They're for someone very special, someone who's been waiting a long time." The woman's eyes flickered with recognition, and her gaze dropped to the roses. She reached out, her fingers brushing the petals with a tenderness that took Morris's breath away. "Eleanor," Morris whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. The woman looked up, her eyes filling with tears. "I came back," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I promised him I would." Morris felt his chest tighten, a wave of gratitude and awe washing over him. "He waited for you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Every day he came here, hoping, believing you'd come back." Eleanor nodded, her tears spilling over as she clasped the roses to her chest. "I thought I'd lost him," she said, her voice breaking. "But I never stopped hoping. I never stopped loving him." Morris felt a tear slip down his own cheek as he watched Eleanor clutch the roses, her love for the man radiating from her in a quiet, powerful wave. In that moment, he knew he had witnessed something extraordinary, a love that had survived the passage of time, a reunion that defied the boundaries of life and death. Would you like me to take you to him?" Morris asked gently, his heart filled with hope. Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Please," she whispered. "I've waited so long." Together, they walked through the terminal, their steps in perfect harmony as if they had known each other forever. When they reached the hospital, Morris led her to the room where the man lay resting, his face peaceful in sleep, a faint smile gracing his lips. Eleanor approached the bed, her hand trembling as she reached out, her fingers grazing his cheek with a tenderness that spoke of a lifetime of love. As if sensing her presence, the man's eyes fluttered open, and when he saw her, his entire face lit up with a joy that Morris had never seen before. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "You came." She smiled, tears streaming down her face as she leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I promised, didn't I?" Morris watched from the doorway, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. This was the reunion he had hoped for, the moment of completion that had made every second of the man's wait worthwhile. And as he turned to leave, giving them the privacy they deserved, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet joy. Outside the hospital, Morris looked up at the darkening sky, the stars just beginning to emerge. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. He had been part of something sacred, a love that had endured beyond all logic, a promise that had bridged the gap between two souls. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he would carry this story with him forever. A reminder that some loves were worth waiting for, no matter how long it took.